All right. Will. Mic on. Okay, hi. Welcome back, everyone. So I'm so pumped to be here. That first session was so riveting. My mind is spinning, and it sets us up perfectly for what we're going to talk about next, which is community-engaged scholarship. And so we'll start briefly by just introducing ourselves really quickly. We have a couple of our panelists here with us today and one online. So for me, I'm Julia Frostino. I am the founding director of the Public Interest Communication Research Lab at West Virginia University, and that is an entity that promotes social and behavioral science for positive social change. We unite social scientists to solve problems through the power of strategic communication and conduct research and community-engaged scholarship in 4 areas, usually. Community advocacy and engagement, risk and crisis communication, media sociology, and science communication, translational science. We work in a variety of topic areas, but one thing we hold steady is that we're working in public interest or public interests, as our previous panelists so appropriately pointed out. We wanted to talk about community-engaged scholarship today because we think that that is one of those areas that bridges the divide that we were just talking about previously. And I personally come at this from the standpoint that it's high time that we problematize the way that universities define and incentivize what we call research, and who is an expert in research. As some of our previous panelists talked about, sometimes the community members will know way more about what they want and need than anybody with any number of degrees can do, and that's where I come at it. But we're gonna dig deeper into what this means. What is community-engaged scholarship? What is research? How can we do it? And how can we serve that role of bridging that divide? So I'm gonna ask my panelists to introduce themselves, give a brief background about themselves, and give us an example of some of the community-engaged scholarship that they take part in and lead before we dig into a few questions, have a small group activity, and then some more Q&A. So that's the plan for today. We'll start over here with George.
Yep, great. Hi, I'm George Villanueva. I'm an associate professor and also doctoral studies program coordinator at Texas A&M. Communication and journalism. We just expanded to communication and journalism this year, welcoming Dr. Harlow and also Dr. McElroy for next year. So we're really excited about the expansion. Before that, I was, this is my first year here at Texas A&M. I live in Houston, though, so I make the commute, but I love the city of Houston. That's why I wanted to be here. I do mainly urban communication work and engage scholarship around urban issues and how to actually involve marginalized communities of color in both, not just city issues, but also university engaged scholarship as well. So before this, I was at Loyola University for 7 years, where we had a major in the School of Communication called Advocacy and Social Change. It was new. I was hired as the first professor there, so it was also really exciting to work for 7 years, kind of working with undergrads around the idea of advocacy and social change. And I finished my doctoral work at USC, the Annenberg School for Communication, where I did a dissertation that later became my book on engaged communication scholarship. So the one highlight, I just want to highlight one project in Chicago, given it was my last stop, and I'm just developing stuff here now in Houston, Texas, is I worked with a community organization called the Coalition for Chinese American Betterment of the Community, and what we worked on was a anti-displacement map and walking tour, where I worked with the organization and residents and organizations and local media to kind of promote the idea through communication asset mapping, which is a method that field-based method that we developed at USC around the idea of identifying positive spaces for community engagement and cultural value and positive social change, because of the idea that, like, Chicago's not different from a lot of Chinatowns in New York, San Francisco, or LA. Because they're so close to downtown, there's a lot of pressure around gentrification and displacing not only working class residents, but primarily also Chinese seniors and so forth. So a lot of the work I do typically is identifying a social change focused community organization and coming up with a memorandum of understanding around how can I work and bring resources as a researcher and university resources to also amplify and also create a more systematized kind of on the ground work around the advocacy that community organizations are doing. So yeah, it was great just doing that, and for my purposes, I create kind of also academic publications, because as an academic, you have to kind of work in both worlds, and that's partly what I also do. So.
Okay, good morning, everyone. So I'm Wenling Liu. So I'm currently associate professor at the Jack J. Valente School of Communication, University of Houston, right from here. It was actually quite a coincidence that actually 3 of the panelists were here today. We were all trained in community-based research back at USC, so we were all proud members of this Metamorphosis project, where a lot of the research was about urban communities, especially communities that are undergoing a lot of transformation. So for me personally, also the fact that I see that as a privilege that I got to have my doctoral training, and right now my research as a tenure-track faculty here in both very ethnically and culturally diverse communities. So having worked in LA and here in Houston, I think that's really a constant reminder of how urban communities today, they're really characterized by diversity in many forms. So my research has been really interested in how communication could become a tool and resources that's going to help those communities thrive. And most recently, my research has been in disaster communication, or how communities that are affected, especially negatively impacted by disasters, they can really recover and rebound back from those events. Well, I still remember my very first year here at UH, the first semester, we got this notice from the university and say, okay, hurricane was coming. So the first week, we're going to postpone the semester, and that was Hurricane Harvey, turned out. So I feel like it was a coincidence, but also that really made me interested in disaster communication, because that was also the time that I realized, well, disaster actually impacted communities, diverse communities very differently. This idea of disaster disparity, those who are already socioeconomically disadvantaged, they tend to be the ones that are most impacted by disasters. So that kind of also started this new chapters of research in disaster communication. So over the past few years in Houston, I've been working with community members impacted by disasters such as Hurricane Harvey, 2 years ago, the snowstorm disasters, and also COVID. I think we also consider that as a really long-term disaster. So I feel like that gave me a lot of appreciation about being able to closely work with diverse communities, and how that impacted not just the formulation of research, but also more importantly, being able to produce research that are seen as helpful, directly useful by different communities.
Thank you, and then Carmen.
Hi, can you hear me?
We can.
Great, awesome. I'm Carmen Gonzalez. I'm an associate professor at the University of Washington in the Department of Communication. And my work is really at the intersection of digital and health equity. So thinking about ways in which technology access, digital tools, digital interventions can be leveraged and tailored to better address racial health disparities. And I do that working with different communities here in Washington. I'm actually in Walla Walla, Washington right now, which is in the eastern part of the state, working with rural communities in addressing mental health issues, issues with service, lack of access to information about mental health, especially for youth. So in action right now, doing some community work, which is why I can't be with you today. Glad we can engage in this way, and this is an example of leveraging our access to technology to do more collaborative work. One project I can share, this is what I call in the before times, before COVID, that really was magnified during COVID. So a lot of the work that I do is helping organizations figure out how to better connect their communities they serve to health resources. I partnered with the Washington State Coalition for Language Access to think about how to better improve access to interpreter services among populations that speak diverse languages. It's been such an issue across the country, really across the globe, to ensure that folks have quality communication with their providers and that they're able to access health information at home, especially during difficult times, during a delicate diagnosis, and just making sure that the whole family unit can support a family member. So we partnered together, we did some applying for grants, writing them together, then did some pilot research, including a nationwide survey and then a local survey. We invited folks from the community organization to do collective data analysis and turn that into some policy and academic work to continue giving that information back to the community so that they could use it in their advocacy efforts. And then after that, it's been kind of COVID nonstop for a little bit, and now kind of turning a little bit more to mental health in rural communities. Thank you for having me.
Thanks, Carmen. I think we have a slide that we could pull up that gives us a starting point too for where we can stand to define community engagement and in community engaged research, or as we call it at West Virginia University, academic community engagement, ACE programs. So this is one definition, and we'll have this for you available at the end with some resources for you, but this is from the Carnegie Foundation to get us started. Community engagement describes collaboration between institutions of higher education and their larger communities, and that can be defined in different ways, for the mutually beneficial exchange of knowledge and resources in a context of partnership and reciprocity. And then they go on to define some of these areas and outcomes that these shared knowledges in bidirectional and multidirectional ways can create outcomes such as enriched scholarship and research and creative activity, teaching, curriculum, helping to form engaged and interested civically engaged citizens and residents, and strengthening democratic values and civic responsibility, and addressing social issues, which is something that we all care about as public interest communication scholars, contributing to the public good. That's something that's kind of woven into the fabric of who we are as scholars. So that's one way that we can start defining research, and we've talked to our panelists, you've met them and heard some of the projects, just a little bit of what they've worked on, but we can take that down for a second and turn to a few questions I'd like to pose to our panelists, and then we'll move on to discuss some of these questions that you might have and some prompts that we have for you to get these chats happening at our tables and then bring it back to the whole group. So our first question is for Wenlin, and Wenlin, you have described to us some of the really rich theory-based research that you have done that's nonetheless really great at engaging communities and around multi-ethnic communities and disaster communication. And that is really enlightening. And I wonder, just to get us started, what do you think communication or community engaged scholarship means, and what's important about how you engage communities throughout your research process? Could you walk us through some of that?
Yeah, sure. So community-based research to me, so I'm sure like everybody in this room, we probably all have different definitions about what that really means to you. But to me, I think community-based research is kind of like more about like how this understanding, acknowledgement about community's knowledge, it's really kind of throughout this entire process of doing research, even from formulating the research question as the first step, carrying this out, being able to listen to the community, gather community's wisdom, knowledge in designing the study, implementing it, and then towards the end stage, which is more about dissemination. I think in our last panel, Erica talked about the importance of translational research. So I also wholeheartly echo that point is, how do we make those findings seen as directly useful by the community? Since I think a lot of those research was conducted with kind of the goal to benefit the community in the first place. So if we're not able to make the finding translational or being able to spread or in an easy to understand way, I think that kind of defeats the whole purpose. So I think one example I would like to share is, so during my research about Hurricane Harvey, one of the project was to look at how official disaster management agency, that they could do a better job communicating with the public when a disaster like hurricane or snowstorm arise. I think there's a lot of kind of this preconceived notion that community members, they're just going to turn to those official sources as their first line of information sources. So we probably read a lot of work that has been done, how can we best tailor the message? Or how do we do a better job doing the translation, which is really important. And we've also seen a lot of those disaster management agencies, they're really doing a good job, translating that in not just English, Spanish, the two most used languages, but also, for example, here in Houston, we have a really big Vietnamese community. So it's actually, you can see a lot of those messages, they're very well translated in Vietnamese or some other ethnic languages. But a shocking, or not so shocking fact is, when it comes to crisis, especially if we are the one from those different communities, those official agencies are not usually their first line of information. So no matter how well you tailor those messages, translate it into a very accessible way, people just don't feel like this is something I would trust or I would immediately go to when there's a hurricane coming in or they need to prepare for a snowstorm, which is something really significant here in Texas. It did happen. That's why I think people feel really put off guard. Okay, there's a snowstorm, which is not the news for people from other parts of the country, but it is pretty significant here. So I think part of the realization about, we can't really assume communities across the board, they're going to just turn to those official channels. So actually a lot of the research by talking to community members, doing survey that has a more representative sample, we know that actually there's very distinct preferences when it comes to which communication channels people are most comfortably turning to or the type of resources that they would trust. An example would be for Hispanic communities, when it comes to find the most trusting sources, no matter about regular issues like, for example, health information. I'm sure Carmen, I know Carmen's research was about how people look for health information, but the same applies when disaster strikes. They actually feel more comfortable having information where they tend to trust sources from their families, from their friends. So I think that kind of gave us a lot of, especially researchers who otherwise are not so well connected with the community, would just assume it's enough for those official agencies to tailor the messages. So make them more accessible linguistically, culturally, but it is really would miss a very significant area, which is, different residents from different community. In the first place, they tend to prefer different sources when it comes to those disaster-related or some other problem-solving related information. So I think that example, something that I experienced in my own research, also is really, I think it speaks to something about if we're not consulting the community members about what they need and what they kind of want in the first place, a lot of those research might be misguided in the first place. So to me, I think that's really part about the importance of community-engaged research. It's about how to put communities' information needs or the type of resources that could best assist them solve problems or cope with disasters, how to really integrate that even at the beginning phase of the research, and also throughout different stages of carrying out the research, disseminating the research.
I love that holistic approach you take, that the community is engaged as an equal partner in co-creating understanding the problem in the first place, and then those solutions. I think that's essential too. And great points. And piggybacking off of that, I'd love to turn to Carmen next. And Carmen, you do so much work that's so important in digital health equity. And I think that a lot of our audience members might wonder, if they're not engaged in community engaged scholarship already, this seems like a lot to take on. What can this look like for you? And I know that you help your students that you mentor and the communities that you interact with at various levels with various scopes of projects. And we would never want to go in and do what Erica referred to before, the parachute project, just jump in, I've solved your problem, now I'm back out again. So if you could talk us through what this tends to look like for you and your students and your communities, and paint that picture for us, I think that would be really great.
Sure, yeah. As Wenlin mentioned, the three of us here on this panel were really blessed and fortunate to have been trained as doctoral students in a way that allowed us to address social issues and work directly with communities, and not have to kind of sacrifice, our research, our professional ambitions. But that doesn't happen everywhere. So it's really tough for especially grad students to see a path towards doing more engaged work. Sometimes there's that messaging and narrative that you have to wait until you get tenure to be more engaged with communities, that you have to sacrifice some of your kind of personal motivations to serve in the public interest. And so modeling after a course that our advisor, Dr. Sandra Ball-Rokeach, developed at USC, I have a graduate seminar on community-based research methods. And I found that talking about methods and opening up possibilities for grad students and even other researchers to find different entry points to community collaboration makes it less overwhelming. So some of these projects that we work on can have different scopes and different intentions and different products at the end, and that's okay. So you can engage communities in so many different ways as long as you're intentional and transparent and reflexive about that partnership and what it looks like and what it's intending to do. So I often talk with my grad students about this kind of continuum of engagement. And sometimes you have the time and the luxury and the resources and support and relationships to do a long-term community-based project, like Wenlin was mentioning, where the question comes from the community, or you craft it together, you seek funding together, and then run through the research process and think about multiple outputs. That can be really tricky for students, especially when they have, academic timelines don't translate to community timelines or timelines in other industries. So sometimes they have to kind of carve a piece out of an engaged project to lead on their own, or to think more about translational efforts. So taking research that might not be super collaborative, but can be translated to address a community need after. And maybe the engagement is limited to workshopping those outputs with community members, thinking about advocacy. How can this research impact policy that is still addressing community needs, but maybe limited by your academic timeline and deliverable? And so opening up that structure and letting students engage in a way that is more manageable. So we have quarter systems here. In my class, all of my students are expected to engage a community partner, but it might be the whole quarter just developing a relationship. So trying to have some rapport, developing a memorandum of understanding, like George mentioned. Often we don't get that training as graduate students or researchers in general to understand that takes time. It takes you putting yourself out there as a researcher, sometimes having to navigate your identity as a community member who's also tied to this institution, where maybe the trust there has to be repaired based on other relationships where folks come in and focus more on their academic ambitions instead of community needs. So in my class, I like to just do small projects, be honest about our ability to engage, try to not do any damaging research activities, and do some repairing and relationship building at first, at least to start.
Differently about what is research from there. You mentioned outputs and products, and for so much of that traditional academic standpoint, a research product and output is a peer-reviewed journal article in this particular type of journal with this type of impact factor. But what is a research output, and how can we redefine that? I think you make some really great points there. Carmen, George, I'd love to turn to you for a second. You are the author of the 2022 book, Promoting Urban Social Justice Through Engaged Communication Scholarship, Reimagining Place. I would love, could you talk to us a little bit about your book and get us thinking a little bit about what are some of the challenges of community engaged scholarship, and then on the flip side, what are some of the ways that we can overcome those challenges and some of the benefits?
Sure. Yeah, and just jumping off Carmen and Winland, the idea for that book, it was, and thankfully I had the collaboration of these two, and also our advisor, Sandra Ball-Rukish at USC Metamorphosis, who, and Carmen mentioned an important point. She never encouraged us, she always encouraged us not to lose ourselves. So the idea here for me was, even as I was doing graduate studies, my previous work, and still I was a community organizer, an activist, urban planner, and working for politics in LA. So a lot of the stuff I talk about in terms of defining engaged communication scholarship in the book, I jump off 4 design criteria: social justice oriented, place-based, as in doing it in the geographies where the affected communities are, particularly marginalized communities of color that I care about; collaborative in terms of making sure that the design process, the research, and later the dissemination is collaborative; and lastly, public, with respect to public as thinking about beyond the academic manuscript and thinking about alternative kind of communication modes to do it. So, but I want to come back to the social justice thing, because what really, I was really inspired and also tickled, and everything. That first panel really spoke to my heart, because, and the whole idea of not sacrificing yourself. And again, as both Carmen and Wenlin mentioned, typically in academia, people, professors or younger professors, junior faculty, are encouraged not to focus not only on community or engaged stuff while they're getting tenure, but particularly social justice focused stuff. And you know, and that was going to be problematic for me because of just my own identity as a engaged scholar and activist. Also, my undergrad work was in Black Studies and History from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and knowing the history of ethnic studies, 1967 to 69, the UC campuses and both San Francisco State had to take over the campuses just to create ethnic studies, Black studies, indigenous studies, Asian American studies, queer studies, and so forth. So while I was even an undergrad at Loyola, or at my assistant professorship at Loyola Chicago, as I was writing my book and thinking about engaged scholarship, I wanted to put the social justice in front and frontline the whole idea that I do social justice communication activism. And if you don't want to give me tenure on this, don't. I mean, because that, and also, and that translated when I applied, when Texas A&M also gave me tenure to come here. They know what type of work I do, and particularly in this type of state, it's not always going to be welcomed. And I do have those conversations in my undergraduate classes, my graduate courses, and in communities in Texas. But I do take a social justice perspective to public. And that means I focus on the idea of intersectionality about not only multiple identities, but multiple sites of oppression from structure that typically has favored white supremacy and settler colonialism and capitalism. So I bring in that critical stuff to make sure that whoever I'm training in my doctoral courses and however I'm writing and engaging community focuses on that. And I'm very honest about the type of politics I have, because I think that's what's particularly lacking in academia, is any investment in politics, particularly social justice politics. Because as the first panel identified, activism is happening on not only the right, but the far right, very foundations of this country that privileges white supremacy. And that happens on academic campuses everywhere, particularly TAMU and UT Austin, and carries over to UH Austin, I shouldn't say UH Austin, that's a bad thing. But that's the whole thing, is like, look, I'm too old now to kind of think about the whole idea of just investing in the idea that data science will rescue us. The reason why we talk about communications and advocacy is because there needs to be a politics, I think. And I know a lot of people in research circles and also journalism circles that are invested in the standards, these professional standards of objectivity. I have debates with journalists and also researchers about this whole idea of objectivity. Whose objectivity are you talking about? So most of my book is about, I have a whole idea, it carries over from a lot of research about who are you doing this research for and for what causes. And I cite a lot of folks from particularly third world, what was traditionally called third world, but now developing countries, but people who have been doing this work at a global level, who have to take a side around social justice, and at times have to throw theory out the window. Not to say I'm not trained in theory, I can go deep into theory, particularly philosophical critical theory, and also social science theory, but at times when you do this work around in communities, sometimes you have to, it's not about balancing it, sometimes you have to, are you there, are you showing up in solidarity, or are you showing up to worsen the problem and just focus on privileging who's in power? So the social justice for me is very important when it comes to engage communication scholarship.
Thanks. In the interest of time, I want to just ask one more question. I have so many. However, I'll ask one, and then we'll turn it over to our group discussions, and that is around ethics. I think that's something we all care about in this room very deeply, and I wonder if we could dig in a little bit, and any of you feel free to jump in here, but what do you think are the particular maybe ethical quagmires that you might experience as a community engaged scholar, and then do you have tips for addressing those? What are some ethical considerations that we should keep in mind? And I'll just open it up to any of you who want to jump in here.
I'll jump in just for 5 minutes.
Okay.
Ethics, oh my God, this is so, ethics is obviously, now we see in the news, the whole idea of ethics and artificial intelligence, right? Obviously there's a long history of ethics being considered at community-based research. Randy Stoker from the University of Wisconsin-Madison writes a lot about engaged scholarship from the sociology and ethics and how do you create ethical IRBs, whether that's in the university, now you can create community IRBs where your research gets ciphered and gets adapted through community processes. So the one thing I want to think beyond ethics, and even though ethics is, I love moral philosophy and ethics. I love any Good Place fans here? The show,
yeah.
So some folks.
Good
But
Place.
in academia nowadays, I kind of want to think about ethics, but think beyond ethics, because I think at times ethics privileges the researcher and the individual researcher. I want to think about now also the idea of harm and who gets harmed in university research processes. And if we think about who gets harmed, it's typically, in particularly the United States, which has been built on white supremacy, settler colonialism, it's always been indigenous folks, black folks, and then also people of color in research processes. So how do we, putting the onus on the idea that people are getting harmed through these processes puts the onus on and highlights the idea there's actual consequences. I think at times this whole idea of ethics, like there's an ethical researcher, there's an ethical AI designer now. I think at times that's privileging this idea, which is gonna blow up where we're gonna have workshops, like we have all these DEI workshops nowadays at university campuses. Now we're gonna have all these AI workshops. It's gonna put too much onus on the whole idea that there's some solutions-oriented perspective that's going to come from the people who are in the C-suites of corporations, who are in the universities and so forth. I think we need to think about the idea of the consequences and who's getting harmed in these processes and return that attention back to the actual communities that we should actually be focusing on, instead of the idea that an ethical researcher or ethical handbook is going to help some said researcher be more ethical. Because at times, just the ecology and the structure of the university environment creates pathways that don't obviously lead there. And we can come up with so many examples already where that doesn't happen. So I would like to also think about who gets harmed in these questions about ethics.
That is such an essential point, because just because we have great research intentions doesn't mean that harm can't result. And I think it's particularly easy to fall into that trap when you really are paving this research road with the best and most purest of intentions, however we want to choose those words, but the harm is real, and it's something that we need to consider. Carmen, do you have anything to add to the ethics?
Yeah, I think where I mostly think about ethics is in the process of dismantling flawed notions of objectivity and things like validity in research, neutrality, and so where I kind of live some ethical dilemmas is when I'm in community and I have to address a very urgent need that I see while I'm a researcher in the moment, and I have to also be a human. And so as a researcher, I shouldn't necessarily cross a boundary, and I should remain objective. But I think that notion of objectivity can be fuzzy, because as a human, I'm going to respond to an urgent need, and I'm going to leverage my resources as someone at a very well-resourced institution to share those tools, those different kinds of resources with community members. So I'm not going to remain an objective researcher in times of need. And especially during the pandemic, that became very clear. So if I have to be out there handing out masks while I'm doing a survey, that's what I'm going to do.
Great point. Wenlin, anything to tack onto that?
Yeah, so I think both Carmen and George really have a great point on that, but I just wanted to add another way of looking at like being ethical is actually the authenticity of researchers' intention. So I think a lot of this is sometimes it might be overlooked. Like why do I need to convince the community participants or to the community that I truly care about this research problem? But I think we do. So I think being able to, because I think also the last panel talked about trust, or how can you really being able to build a trusting relationship. I think being able to communicate that you're authentic in your research objective, you're having true connections about the problems, the issues that are affecting them. It's not like you're just using them as subjects to collect data. So I think being able to communicate authenticity in the research, it's also kind of, to me, that's really fundamental to being ethical in this process.
We're at Houston, so we should probably mention Brené Brown, right? So like vulnerability is what comes to mind when you say that to me, that really incredible need to be able to be vulnerable as the researcher and with your research participants. So that's a great point. Thanks, Wenlin. We'd like to pop up a slide now because we want, there are so many points we've touched on, and I hope that you are interested in exploring some of these with the folks at your table. So if we could put up the slide, we have some prompts for you for a discussion that we could take for just about 15 minutes to talk with your tables. And when you're done with that 15 minutes, wherever you've landed, we'd love if somebody would share with the whole group. We'll choose a couple of tables to do this, a main takeaway or challenge or lesson, something big that popped up from this discussion that you had. And then we give you a couple of prompts. Feel free to take it anywhere else that you want to go as well. But what are your fears or hesitations about community engaged scholarship? what are some successful strategies for community engagement and collaboration, or lessons learned if you're taking part in this type of activity? How do, for some of you who are at universities who are doing a good job of this, or could or can, universities provide institutional support for this type of work? And if you are engaged in this, whether a practitioner or an academic, somebody in the community, is there something that you wish you knew earlier if you're doing it now? And if you're not doing it yet, what is burning? What do you need to know? What do you want to know? So if we could discuss that for about 15 minutes or so with your tables, and then be prepared to share. We'll choose a couple of tables to share that main takeaway, and then engage back with the panelists. We can ask some questions and answers with our panelists here, and Carmen as well. And I hope that our folks on Zoom will enjoy this discussion with Carmen there to lead you. I mean, I'm a professor, I have to. Any questions before we start this activity? I can't help it. All right, well, go ahead, chat away, and I'll yell at y'all when it's time to come back over. Okay. If we could wrap up our discussions and get ready to share. All right. I know. The last panelist said that this set looks like HGTV, but I think it kind of looks like Bravo after show, so I can get dramatic if you want. All right. A little bit? No? All right.
Totally looks like
Okay.
a
I'm
reunion.
so excited to hear what you all have been talking about and what questions you may have for our panel. So why don't we start maybe Carmen online, if you wouldn't mind sharing or tapping somebody who's up. Yeah, please, online folks.
Yeah. Am I back on Spotlight?
We'll get you spotlighted in a second. Great.
There we go. By the way, that looks like a Housewives backdrop. So I totally
This is what I'm saying, right?
love it. You guys look great.
Should I splash George with the water?
A little bit, yeah.
It looks like everybody agreed.
Yeah, I know. I drank it all, though. I'll refill it. Okay, sorry. Go ahead. How are we doing online, and what did you all talk about?
Yeah, we had a little bit of time to think about the pace of research with other kind of demands, and thinking about, you know, slowing down and what value that would bring to all of these processes that we do. Does anybody want to share?
From Zoom?
I just-
Yeah. Yeah.
Perfect.
Sorry, I don't know if someone else jumped in. We talked about going into other communities as privileged, from a privileged standpoint, of either our race or being even like an academic standpoint, and how difficult that is to not let our agenda set communities' agendas. But ultimately that so many of our structures are based on funding mechanisms and academic logistics like semesters or quarters. And so that's really complicated and problematic. We didn't get a ton of time to get into solutions, but Carmen brought up this, the really great reference to slow research that feminist scholars have been talking about, and really building trust. Piper talked about building trust and how important that is. And then Laurie Hennessy brought up talking about, the white supremacy of I think organizational structures, and just bringing all these reflective exercises into the process is likely going to produce better relationships with our communities than not.
And it's okay if things don't work out. The reflective process means that sometimes we have to be honest and say, we have to pivot, or this didn't go well, next time, let's try to do better.
Fantastic, thanks. All right, do we have a volunteer table that wants to share something and then maybe ask a question? Yes, please.
Again, I'm Asia Mukes from the University of Oklahoma, and I share my experience of going to Tulsa during the Tulsa Race Massacre in 2021 to do research on corporate investment during the centennial activities. There's a lot of corporate dollars flowing through Tulsa during the time. I'm originally from Oakland, California. I lived in Washington, D.C. I live in Oklahoma City, and I go to Tulsa. And even as a Black woman on the ground, there was a level of distrust from residents trying to figure out why I was there, especially because there were thousands of people who had descended on Tulsa during that, 3 or 4 day time period. And the whole point was like, why are you here? What are you doing this for? Where is the information going to go? There was a lot of concern around anonymity, and there was a lot of concern about where the information would live. And so I felt like sometimes when we get into a conversation around entering into communities and spaces, we don't acknowledge the fact that that doesn't just exist, or the concern doesn't just exist for white people, right? It exists for lots of different types of people entering into lots of different types of spaces. Even me as a Black woman entering into Tulsa, right? And so I want to just call that out real quick and acknowledge that. But my education, I think, did give me some privilege in there, right, in that space, because I share with folks that I was a PhD student at the University of Oklahoma, which is the flagship university in the state. And it was sort of like, oh, oh, okay, well, I see you, you know? And so that gave me a little bit of access. But I think just thinking about the privilege that your identity brings you into any particular space. I am considerate of that, being a Black woman from California and having traveled all over the country. There's a sense about folks from California in general, but Black folks from California in particular, going into Black spaces. So, yeah. That's all we got. We just start storytelling.
I love that. I love that. Do we have another table? Yes, please. Microphone is on its way.
Hey, so I don't know if, okay, there we go. At our table, we had a great discussion and in lots of different ways, but the main takeaway is the university has the biggest role to play in how you're seen in the community, how trusted you are on all sides. Here we talked about, an NC State versus a Duke, and what kind, tell me which side do you think is going to be in caring for the community. If you're the university that you go to, you may not be part of that community, and you rely on the other professors or the established relationships that the university has with the community, and that can be problematic in your area of study. And I also pointed out, George, I'm a LULAC activist, here in Houston, 15 years. I didn't know you could exist at Texas A&M because of the reputation. And that goes, again, the university that you're part of gives you a lot of credibility or can hinder your work and your outreach.
Thanks. Another table. We have one over here. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. One of the questions that came up when we were discussing fears was not necessarily what am I afraid about the situation, but more so, are we prepared as researchers or academics to actually enter that space? I think that's where a lot of the fear and insecurity comes from, and I think sometimes we know that fear comes from the unknown, and how do we resolve that? By learning. And so I'm curious, and our question for the panelists were, if you work for a university, what have you personally done to ensure that your knowledge and your resources are accessible to community activists, not just through yes, screen readers and all of that, but also financially accessible, or as much as we can search the internet, sometimes we know that doesn't always work. And so what are we doing to actually spread that knowledge and make it accessible, because we know tuition prices are astronomical?
Yeah, this is great. So let's turn to our panelists here for a question on accessibility and dissemination of your research and your research products, and how are you getting that back into the hands of the community and to the others who may benefit from it most. So.
Yeah, well, I would like to share an experience about the research that I conducted back in the day when I was a doctoral student. So I was working with a community-based health groups in LA called Health Research Coalitions, Community Health Coalition. So part of the research was, as researcher, we came out to work with community groups to collect, the project was really, we were trying to help the organization how to better build collaboration relationships So I think that process was rewarding, not because it was the one that we were able to work with the organization, survey, or, all our partner organizations to understand what helped them build a strong coalition. So I think the community, the directors and members from the community organization, we ended up writing academic papers together. So I see that as a very, a great way to, in terms of how to make the research findings accessible. So of course, it is still research paper is probably for the paywall, but then I think the fact that we're engaging practitioners in the academic paper writing process in itself, I think it kind of brings some of the findings. So, in terms of helping us disseminate the findings back to the community. So the research study found, okay, here are a few takeaways about how to help organizations build better coalition. And after that, we also had post that the organization helped us kind of provide a summary about research on their website as a blog post. So kind of I think there are definitely more creative ways of especially today, I think a lot of those were thinking about digital platforms, even make a podcast or a little short video to kind of provide those findings in a more accessible way. But I still think being able to kind of collaborate with practitioners in producing those research articles could be a very useful model to think about how this research work is written with their input, their perspective incorporated in the first place. And then also, I think that will also greatly help us to bring, to share the finding back to the community.
I think that's a great point about engaging the community members in those publications, some of those traditional research products. I'd also love for us to investigate what is a research product. Is it only a peer-reviewed article, or is it something else? I can give you an example from, as you said, everything COVID, Carmen, just everything became COVID for a while for so many of us in this space. When we're doing statewide surveys in West Virginia on COVID-19 vaccine perceptions, and we're talking to healthcare providers and focus groups and interviews, and we're getting results of all of this, yes, we're engaging them, and I think that's a great point, Wenlin, about bringing them into the academic side, but also on the flip side, what is a research product in that scenario outside of that? For example, us, when we're hearing time and time again that practitioners are having issues in healthcare providers in making appropriate recommendations, is a research product in that regard the COVID-19 vaccination due date calculator that's on our state health department website that we created as a tangible deliverable as a result of research findings, implementation science, Or same thing, when we talk to healthcare providers, we survey people across the state, we do focus groups and interviews, taking the time to get onto continuing medical education credit webinars with healthcare providers to share that information with them so that they can make those data-driven decisions and use that information in their daily work, or even just integrating workshops into what you're doing, where you do trainings with the knowledge that you have and gain and work with them. Those, are they not research products that are vetted by experts? Aren't these healthcare experts experts? Aren't the people in the communities experts in their own lives? And if they're using what you build and it's based on research, is that not a research project? That's a question I have for universities. Looks like we have a question over here too.
I just wanted to note as a practitioner, I totally want to reaffirm what you're sharing.
Oh, sorry, wait for the microphone.
I just wanted to reaffirm what you're saying because some years ago I was directing communications for the World Wildlife Fund's global climate change campaign. It was a policy advocacy, international policy advocacy effort. The campaign partnered with academics who were doing research on the impacts of climate change, all sorts of different ones, on migratory birds, on the oceans. Now this is going back to the late 1990s. So what we would do is every other month, we would produce something, we would take their research, and we would reference it, promote it, but we would produce sort of a 4-page equivalent to a 4-page magazine article that captured everything about their research in layman terms. And this was incredibly successful in getting news coverage around the world, and also in educating a lot of different stakeholders on what was causing climate change and what needed to be done. So that was just an example to you. We had partnerships with academic researchers from around the world, and we were promoting the research and the results, and we were doing policy advocacy, and we were educating, at that time, the news media. So I think you're absolutely spot on.
Yeah, that practitioner outreach itself, community engagement with practitioners for research dissemination. George, did you have thoughts on the dissemination piece?
Oh, sure. Yeah, I'll focus on, I won't do LA because it's almost been 10 years since I've been back, but I'll just focus on Chicago. So a couple strategies I do, and a lot of it is curriculum-based. But with that Chinatown anti-displacement community project, besides the academic stuff I was doing and the peer-reviewed stuff, what I also did with the collaborating organization was write a community research report that we put out and shared, and that was based on the focus groups and the mapping that we did. Additionally, I did some training and workshops with them to write a press release to attract media, not just local media like the Chicago Tribune and so forth, but also ethnic media such as the Chinese local media there, the Streets blog, and folks to come cover, because we, instead of just doing writing, we also did, again, a map, which was a pocketed map where you could fold, and we did an anti-displacement walking tour where we brought people and collaborated with the Chinatown organization youth group to have them talk about their neighborhoods to the people who were coming. So that was one way to do that with that project. Secondly, another project in Chicago I was doing was hip-hop culture for social change, where I was working with mainly a lot of the hip-hop culture artists in Chicago. And one way, besides the academic stuff I did, was create a class called hip-hop culture and social change, where it would have the different folks from the different 5 elements, whether that be turntablism, rapping, breakdancing, graffiti, or knowledge, the nonprofit groups, come in and also share what they were doing. I would give them stipends, and also I wrote a grant to have them do performances on campus. So it was a way to also kind of get folks also paid and also share their artwork out, and also reimagine what is not only research, but I think the whole idea is knowledge production. It's ways of knowing, and I think if we can get, that's why I try to, like, in nowadays I try not to talk about science and research as much anymore when I talk about the scholarship I do. I try to take into account the ideas that you know differently, and yeah, you can go to universities and go to know, but a lot of the stuff, given I'm a Filipino American of the diaspora, I also learn ways of knowing from the people who I grew up with and so forth. So I think there needs to be also a discussion around rethinking whether we should even use terms like social science research, or, again, I think part of this gets back to the university and how at times it not only has framed things, but how it's created the structure where certain ways of knowing are erased. And I think we're having that bigger conversation in communication now. Obviously if you're in communication, everyone's seen the communication so white kind of journal article that came out 5 years ago. And that's really, it's a reckoning for communication, journalism, and media studies, just to have we're seeing a lot more activity around different ways of knowing getting inserted, where we don't have to only depend on the structures of how research has been seen, because it's only really been seen and privileged by a certain group. And I think the more we expand to how different folks come to knowledge, then we can think about getting away from just thinking about academic manuscripts as the be-all, end-all of research. Because, particularly if you do engage scholarship or you do work with communities, you know that's not the case. So might as well just start talking about that more. So.
Definitely, and I think that a lot of that has to happen at the university level too. I think we have a question over here if you want to bring over the mic. You know, because that piece of incentivizing, as I think Erica was getting at in the last panel, if the route to tenure is publish or perish, that creates all of this engagement work as something that you have to do on the side, or as George said, risk like, this is my identity, and if you don't like me, I'm gone. But you might be gone, you know, and that's a real consideration for many scholars, and not everybody can or will or wants to take that stance. And so is it double work? Is it treading underwater this whole time? It's a tough balance, and I think it's a real consideration for academics, but there's so much more that can be done on the university level to incentivize and name and understand and value and write into promotion and tenure documents and handbooks what is community engaged scholarship. And with that in mind, we have some resources that I'd like to put up on the screen before we come over to you for your question. We have on the slide, you can, and this will be distributed to, I think Angela has for you. First of all, definitely check out George's book. That's what it looks like. It's in our resources list. There's a QR code, and there is some community engaged scholarship resources that will take you to various places, some university examples of universities that are taking this on and what that might look like, how they're defining it, how they're valuing it, incentivizing this type of work. Obviously still more work to do, various consortiums, various conferences that you can go to if you're an engaged scholar. The Carnegie Foundation's elective classification for community engagement is something your institutions, if you're coming at this from the academic side, might be interested in pursuing. It's kind of a laborious application process, but you can get that designation, and that might help turn the tides for any of you who may be trying to pursue community engaged scholarship, but don't necessarily yet have it recognized at your university level, and that creates that bind for you. And other areas there too, so you can check those out later, but just wanted to make sure I got your eyeballs on that, and you know that those resources are available just as a quick reference, and certainly not comprehensive by any means. But I'd love to come and wrap us up with a question over here, or comment from this table, please.
Thank you so much. My name is Urmi Datta, and I'm also a faculty and a community engaged scholar. George, I wanted to thank you for bringing up, what I understand as epistemic justice, sort of really raising these questions around knowledge production, around erasure of knowledges, whose knowledges are valued, ways of knowing. As a person of color in the US and as someone from the global South, that's very close to my heart. Relatedly, something that comes up a lot is sort of how in our discourses, in our rhetoric, we get so caught up in this divide, the university or the academy versus the community, as if they're mutually exclusive. And the community then becomes a site of intervention. And so sort of, then we kind of replicate binaries around where expertise lies, where theory lies, and so on and so forth. But what happens to people who cannot be slotted into those categories, who may be, knowledge producers in the academy, who may be researchers, but who are also from the very communities that they're working with, where the relationship is not one of, quote unquote, entering the community, but one of re-envisioning a relationship within their own communities, over time as some of their affiliations may change. And who are also activists within their own communities, and who are activists in the university in trying to push for changes, like the kinds of changes that many of you have been talking about. So I was just wondering if any of you have reflections on that, on kind of, what do we do collectively to disrupt that kind of divide?
Oh, I think that's a great question. In the interest of time, I'm going to ask our panelists who has a 30-second answer? You can solve all the world's problems in 30 seconds. Are you ready? And begin. Who's got it? We really do have to wrap up. Carmen, do you have something?
I just want to acknowledge
Yeah.
that point you made is exactly, I think, part of the 30-second is the community isn't the only site of intervention. Actually, the university is. And as you mentioned, epistemological violence has happened, particularly to the colonized and the indigenous folks here in this country. So I think part of it is recuperating that. Not just decolonizing knowledge, but decolonizing the land, which is what indigenous folks would argue, so.
And I would say this is part of our intervention right here, this group and meetings like this.
Oh, I think that's a great spot to end. Yes, the Bravo after show is over, and I didn't splash you with water, George.
You can.
Thank you all for your time, and who am I handing this off to? Angela, maybe? Yeah.
Here we go. Thank you. All right, so now we have a break for lunch. There are various places, and we have some maps on the registration table with a list of places on the back. The student center is right across the street. There's a restaurant downstairs here where you can grab something. Please come back. We're starting actually at our program is 1:15, but at 10 after 1, we're doing a really fun item giveaway. So 10 after 1, come back for that.